Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending when you're watching this, as always, is my usual intro there. So we are going to be going into the idea of stigma management, which means we're going to be covering some concepts by Erving Goffman and more such things as this, right? But welcome to Module 4, Stigma Management Article Breakdowns. As always, these are short and concise, or at least they try to be, and just a quick way to look at and understand what you are reading with some insights from myself as your instructor. This week, we are reading about stigma management and paying particular attention to Erving Goffman's description of stigma. So let's get into it. So let's start with Goffman's idea of stigma, right? Goffman's description of stigma is that we are marked by others' reactions when our identity is considered deviant. We can be stigmatized based on character flaws, a physical condition, or because of the group we associate with. Now, this isn't going to be a huge portion on Goffman. Please review the stigma lectures for the details on discredited versus discreditable identity. But when it comes to stigma and the ways that we manage our stigma through passing, covering, or even disclosing. But essentially, stigma is a huge deal, and we will talk about it in the lecture slide more than we'll talk about it here. But this is kind of a TLDR breakdown of his readings, right? Stigma, discredited, discreditable, and stigma management. But we're going to first move into one of the first readings for this week by Miller, which is the idea of men who cheer. So in Men Who Cheer, the authors studied male cheerleaders and how they neutralize stigma. Sports are considered in a lot of situations masculine, especially in regards to competitive sports. And I will note that the sample of this study had a lack of representation within the diversity of the sample as a whole and was homogeneous towards the individuals and could be an interesting study if it included more diversity within the future. You'll notice that in the methods. Now, cheerleading as a sport is seen as feminine, and in a female-dominated arena, participants who are male tend to have their sexuality questioned. So based on observations and interviews with colleagues or college cheer squad, right? But Miller found that the male cheerleaders were often labeled as non-masculine. They were also labeled as gay men, and they were even questioned about their sexuality by other cheerleaders. So the male cheerleaders use face saving, as Goffman talks about it, techniques to minimize the stigma of participating in female-dominated sports of cheerleading. And the female cheerleaders often help the males maintain their masculinity by doing femininity and being more submissive to the men. So the men also demonstrated masculinity by establishing toughness and aggressiveness in their image portrayals. They were also found to have extremely higher levels of sexualization towards women and even more homophobic ways of acting, hypermasculine. So it's very interesting to look at the work here of using Miller's work, which was that sports in general are masculine, male cheerleaders used face-saving techniques, and then re-establishing and being more strong on sexual objectification of women and also homophobia. Now, in the next chapter, what we're going to be looking at, let me quickly adjust my face so I'm not blocking this, is a really complicated topic that we're going to talk about in this class. And it tends to be one that is super interesting and powerful. But it comes down to like what we're looking at in this situation. And that is Davis's idea of the stigma management. And this is a really powerful chapter in general, overall, right? So Davis talks about the idea in his article on the stigma of those who have been labeled as transabled. Body integrity identity disorder is a condition where individuals who are disabled or have body impairments such as blindness or an amputated limb. The study was based on an analysis of posts on transabled.org website over 17 years ago. There are moral stigmas presented on this website. That is, people who don't have conditions have posted on the website their stigmatized statements of the transabled. For instance, the transabled is described as a category of a perverse or a fetish. Another moral stigma surrounding is emotional weakness, such as the person needing attention. Still another is dishonesty. The non-transabled person accuses the transabled of lying about their condition. The other theme that emerges from the content analysis is greed. Non-transabled accused the transabled of wanting attention and resources given to them that they believe should be going to people that they considered being truly disabled. Ways that the transabled reported to those moral stigmas are neutralize the claims based on medicalization, a la, this is a medical disorder that needs to be medically treated. The support for the inclusion as official mental disorder is significant for legitimate claims as a medical condition. The other way that Transabled managed the stigma was through the self-actualization. That embracing the transabled allowed the self-allowed person to have a moral right to a fulfilling life this way. I would like to add, as I have taught this class many times, that I have had students who have combed the darker side of Reddit and found that without legitimizing a diagnosis through the DSMV, the community has not disappeared. Even though the website transabled.org is no longer up, you can look at its backlogs, but it has become unregulated, a la black market, right? The website, as I just mentioned, it got cataloged, so people still have an idea and you can read these things. But when you don't have identities or connected to things such as this, run into situations where subcultures have taken an idea and expanded upon it into alerting and scary measures. Without a claim to guidelines, the black market of emotional and labeled-based moral stigma and identities can be built and upheld without rules or guidelines. This has resulted in titles such as trans age flux, and my age changes depending on day, and similar to my gender fluid idea, just with age. And then there's also one called mentally transabled, the desire to gain mental disorders that one doesn't already have. Some examples can be built upon BPD, NPD, and bipolar disorder. So that's narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and bipolar disorder, and much more. It is a reality that when we don't apply a label or a categorization or legitimize diagnosis, the market can control itself. Interesting things to think about. Now, the next chapter we're going to be going into is Passing as Black, which is a super interesting chapter. In the Passing as Black, the researchers studied people who self-identified as biracial, mixed race, or multiracial. In some instances, participants passed as either Black or white. They did this using stigma management techniques, as Goffman laid out as passing or covering. When this wasn't possible, they had to accent their Black or white ancestry through identity work. Accenting is the opposite of covering. While covering is used to downplay an attribute about yourself, accenting is to accentuate or emphasize it, right? This is done through 5 stages, as verbally identifying or disidentifying, saying out loud, yes, I am this, or no, I am not that. Selective disclosure is deciding when to reveal or to conceal about the identity, while selective association is deciding whom, or who, which group to associate with. Manipulating the phenotype is a type of change something about your appearance, such as straightening one's hair or tanning. And another way was to accent is to use cultural symbols that we perceive and associate with a particular group. The authors found that motivations for passing as Black were either to fit in, avoid stigmatized identity, or for the advantage in a situation. This chapter is super powerful, especially for any of you who are from multi-ethnic families, because it's interesting to think about how many times you've either downplayed or upplayed different things to fit into different communities. And I challenge you to think about that. Now, one second here, we're going to go into the next chapter. Now, Rochelle and Kaufman looked at homeless kids study done at the organization that helps homeless families, and included observations as well as informal interviews with 97 homeless children or kids and their parents in the San Francisco area. The kids are aware of negative stigmas that come with being homeless, and they have strategies to manage the stigma. Strategies of inclusion include conforming to the social norms and acceptable behavior. They aim to fit in a harmonious with their non-homeless counterparts. They may do this by creating friendships, or they may pass or cover as non-homeless by the way that they present themselves in everyday life through dress. Strategies of exclusion are done to gain social acceptance, and this is done without trying to create a harmonious atmosphere. So they may do this by trying to appear tougher and more mature. This behavior may be taken as aggressive and threatening, and if this is the case, that when they make it tougher or more mature, the kids actually may become further stigmatized. So it's really interesting to think about the ways that they try to manage the identity. It can be positive and it can be negative. So as we're coming to an end on this section, right, powerful topics this week, and we will get into more details. And as we move forward, this book does test your ability to separate theory and personal bias, and I challenge you to come in with as little bias as possible and study it with the foundational tools we have been discussing when looking at studying deviance. So this chapter plays hard into moral levels of acceptance. I haven't had an in-class to date not have a harder time with Davis's chapter, and I challenge you to think why, if it did. This chapter can give you or others some uncomfortable vibes or icks. Look at why it does this, right? Why in Ben Miller's work do men and women play a toxic masculinity? Shouldn't men who cheer be allies or understanding? Why do they become more aggressive to save face? I challenge you to think about that. A term not used directly in Rochelle and Kaufman's work is code switching. I'm curious to think what you think of this, which can also be applied to Kayana and Johnson's articles. And what are your thoughts on this idea of code switching? Challenge you to write about that in Yellow Dig. So, some parting thoughts, and I'll see you in the next lecture.